Hollywood has an issue because it's not doing very much that's original. It has to effectively rent IPs and communities from other industries. But the problem with that is
Simon Pulman, media and entertainment law expert.
Hollywood created Netflix. We've gone from a paradigm where if you were to look at the highest grossing films of 1993, 1994, 1995, these are based on original concepts or they're based on works of literature, something like Jurassic Park. And yet here we are in 2025, we're about to have, I think it's the 7th Jurassic Park movie, which is indicative of how things have changed. If you're an individual and you stick your neck out to get this original piece of content made and it fails, you very well are going to lose your job and possibly will be tarred for the rest of your career. Fear drives so much.
Hey man, how are you?
I am great. Thank you, Pete. How about yourself?
Yeah, really good, man. Really good. It's an absolute pleasure to have you on. But I guess before we dive into some of the stuff we've talked about previously and what we wanted to focus in on, let's maybe start with a quick who you are, what you do and why.
My name is Simon Pulman. I am an attorney with the firm of Prior Cashman based in New York City. I'm an entertainment lawyer. So I work with companies who are developing, producing and financing all forms of media and entertainment, including television, motion pictures, podcasts, video games, publishing, and so on. I make deals. I help them put together projects. Ultimately, I think driven by passion and interest, but we're in a really interesting time for the entertainment business at the moment. A lot of technological changes, a lot of changes to how audiences interact with media and entertainment. And that makes it a really interesting time for deal makers.
And you were at GDC just before, so I'd love to get your take in regards to what it was like this year versus prior.
Certainly. So you'll see a lot of hot takes on LinkedIn and elsewhere about GDC. I am not a veteran of the conference. This was only my third time going, but from my perspective, it was incredibly productive. I find people within the video game industry to be really thoughtful and welcoming. We had a lot of really great chats. With that said, the games business is also changing and has changed over the last decade or so and finds itself in a little bit of flux. There are new platforms like Roblox, for example, where I think there's a lot of opportunity, but also is an unsophisticated market. It's changing from a geographic standpoint as well. So across the board, really not different from the film business in some ways, has challenges to face to sort of for the next decade and onwards.
One of the things I wanted to focus in on quite a lot is this shift in audience preferences and how entertainment as a whole is changing. Obviously, there's loads we can touch upon here. In previous discussions, I've talked about Transmedia with Peter Levin and also with your friend Russell as well, Russell Binder, in regards to that landscape and remakes and the health of the industry. So, yeah, what is your overarching opinion on this shift in audience preferences and how entertainment is evolving as a whole?
Entertainment has really changed dramatically, I would say, over the last 20 years or so, owing substantially to the internet. And that has come through technological changes, including the size and quality of a screen that you can have in your living room, the immediacy of being able to access content, but also in terms of audience behaviors around content, whether that's fandom and community, whether that's sort of real-time social interaction. We've seen this rise of several, what we call black hole video games, where people are not only playing the game, but they're playing in a multiplayer way and they are connecting with their friends while they do so. And I think that's particularly crucial for the younger generation. And presumably that's something they will continue to expect from their entertainment as they grow. If you look at the film business, we've gone from a paradigm where if you were to look at the best picture nominees and highest grossing films of 1993, 1994, 1995, these are, largely either what we call spec scripts based on original concepts, or they're based on works of literature, something like Jurassic Park. Mm. And yet, here we are in 2025, we're about to have, I think it's the 7th Jurassic Park movie, possibly, which is indicative of how things have changed. The major motion picture business has really leaned into big event movies. And what we seem to be learning is that in order for people to leave their homes and to get them out of the home, it has to be something that they feel like is worth seeing on a big screen, as opposed to just staying in and watching whatever is on Netflix or perhaps what they can just rent through their television set. So things are really changing. I mean, let me ask you a question. What was the last movie you saw in theaters, Pete?
To be honest, it would have been a long time ago. I think I got dragged by my wife to see like Bridget Jones or something. And I say dragged, but I quite enjoyed it when I was there. But it was, to be fair, I'll put it this way. Ever since I saw Matt Damon give an interview about the evolution of cinema and how the impact of streaming has had upon that industry, that kind of, to me, just reflected upon an industry that's on its knees, really. It's a bit like that thing when we were growing up, right? The whole going to Blockbuster, grabbing a movie, going back home. Like, cinema didn't really evolve as quick as it potentially could have. And it seemed to me that streaming just kind of came and took their market share. And as a consequence, it looks like, in the Jurassic series that you mentioned, it looks to me that it's easier to make sequels and subsequent movies off a spin-off franchise than it is to make original content because of the risk factor in regards to budget. The demand, if you're going to go to the cinema to pay, I went to the Odeon and we paid it was like about 40, $50 to go. The return on investment isn't really there when you can go, well, actually, I can just take Netflix and pay my $9.99 a month and actually get decent original content. So
sure. And LCD televisions, now 4K, are dirt cheap effectively. And so that's the way that business seems to have gone. Obviously Marvel has for over a decade has sort of made a whole business out of these big event things that are interconnected. But, that's the way that business seems to be going. In terms of other things, the rise of international content, both local originals. We haven't seen anything sort of pop off on the same level as something like Squid Game, but budget's much lower internationally for both production of locals and even US originals if you're going and shooting in Eastern Europe. But then we also have the rise of Asia across film, television, and gaming. Some of the brands and the worlds where people are most loyal to are coming out of manga, anime, webtoons, those types of worlds. I think that has been something that's surprised Hollywood, the rise of video game brands. Perhaps it shouldn't be surprising because what tends to resonate with you are things that you loved when you were growing up. A lot of people now grow up watching anime, playing games, engaging with alternative forms of media.
It also has that opportunity to build community. So if you look at even back to the days of Dungeons and Dragons back in the day, like as much as the game itself, it was building communities and friendship groups. The same goes in regards to manga, comic books, and so on and so forth. If you build that kind of connective tissue within an audience, then again, if it's executed well, then you will have resonance in that regards. But I'd love to get your thoughts on Hollywood as a whole, because where we are at the moment, let's look at like Snow White, for example, as a case study. Like Snow White, to me, it didn't seem like the right reboot to be making. I'd love to get your take as to budget versus return on investment and what your viewpoint is on that story as a whole.
I mean, look, I have no insider intel. Everything I would say would come from being an observer. Yeah. To me, it seems like Disney has settled into a pillar of having three pillars of effectively strategy and motion picture: Marvel, Star Wars, and then live action remakes. And you can understand why they are doing it strategically, because these are familiar brands, therefore lower marketing costs, possibly lower risk. They can live alongside the animated originals on Disney Plus. And historically, they've been very successful. You look at Beauty and the Beast, you look at, I think Cinderella overperformed, Little Mermaid even quite recently did quite reasonably well. And then, of course, what you're doing the hope is that you're reintroducing these brands, or you're introducing them to a new generation who then will buy the merchandise, will go to see them at the park, and the flywheel continues. As to why Snow White didn't work, you are correct. Like, when you are evaluating the revenue of any product, any entertainment product, from a game to a movie, you have to look at the budget, right? So GTA only sells 5 million copies in a year, it'll be a disaster. If Longlegs makes 100 million on a 10 million budget, that's fantastic. Not so for Snow White. And I think part of there may have been some residual COVID production costs that really sort of amplified things, but also reshoots and change of the creative direction, all against the question mark of how relevant actually is this property to our audience. And I think everybody really has an image of Snow White in their mind, and we know it's culturally important, but it's also a very old movie, and it's obviously a classic, that story that goes back hundreds of years. And they were sort of caught between these two approaches of honoring that original IP and feeling that they had to update it. I do want to address, though, your point about community, because you asked me what I think about Hollywood, and I think that is a key aspect. Hollywood because I think that community is really undervalued by the industry overall. I think that there are pockets of sort of media businesses and industries that are doing really a great job with community. I think the games business is ahead. I think, you see some of these Roblox creators, and we'll talk about Roblox in a bit, who are creating communities around their games, but also something like Book Talk, and when a Colleen Hoover adaptation comes out, or eventually one of these Sarah Maas books, like A Court of Thorns and Roses, it's a big fantasy series, but it has a really loyal following and they interact with each other. And that's just a huge part. We saw a little bit of that around Wicked. We saw a little bit of it around Barbie in terms of energizing these communities. On the game side of things, the sort of a little bit around the Transmedia and Fallout and Last of Us, perhaps. Certainly the Super Mario Brothers movie. But as you say, like this goes back to Dungeons and Dragons, but I don't think it really there's been that level of thought that's been put into it. The classic Hollywood approach has always been, we've made a movie, now let's think about how we're going to market it and create the opening weekend. Whereas I think really you've got to go the other direction and think about, well, who's the audience for it? Is it in the pre-existing audience? How can we energize them? How can we engage them? How can we honor the IP in a way that's going to make them happy and then create something that can be enduring?
And it's also the bit about like the longer organic route rather than like you mentioned the opening weekends, but I know to some films and to some games, the opening weekend is key, but if you're able to nurture a community and nurture an organic engagement over a longer period of time, then that reaps the longer term rewards. Look at things like Friday Night at Freddy's. That's got a longer, slower, organic route towards an audience growth. It allows for a deeper level of engagement, and you can kind of use multiple different pillars to drive brand activation. That's the thing that does intrigue me. And you mentioned like Book Talk, but a good example as well is like Reese Witherspoon's approach. If you look at her like book group, and then after on the back end of that, she looks at the successful ones and makes like movies off the back end of that. So, it's being a bit more wise to not just assuming what people want to see and consume, but it's being a bit more wise to what people are actually watching and consuming.
Well, and it's interesting because it's really hard for Hollywood movie studios to do that, right? They've got these quarterly demands from investors to have these returns to match previous quarters and previous years. And so it's very hard for them to build up these things slowly. Certainly in independent film, it has happened a little bit. You think most obviously that Terrifier series, which, even the most recent one was an incredibly low budget movie, and they built up that fandom over time. But this is why effectively Hollywood has an issue because it's not doing very much that's original. It has to effectively rent IPs and communities from other industries. So that could be Book Talk, fantasy novels or spicy romance or whatever that might be. It could be the video game business. And you're right, something like Five Nights at Freddy's. I mean, I still can't believe how incredible that opening weekend was,
crazy,
because it went day and date on Peacock and it still made over $80 million opening weekend. It's absolutely phenomenal. But you're right, that was built on the back of effectively one person creating this brand, creating this lore, engaging with the community over a really, really long period of time. And I still don't even know that Universal knew what it had found with that. And guess what? It won't be the last time we see some trade publication, Deadline or Variety say, shocker, or what a surprise. Because they haven't factored in the community value.
What's your viewpoint on risk, I guess, in regards to content as a whole? Because when I say this, if you look at like big budget, there's almost an appreciation that risk has to be fairly low. So everything, almost like the storytelling has to be to a set example that people are used to because they're fearful of risk. But then on the other side, you look at things like one of my favorite production houses at the moment is, it's been for a while, but A24. And if you look at what they produce, like it's just incredible content. Like I'm just watching Civil War again because I'm a big fan of Alex Garland. And if you look at that, like this huge depth of content, it's originality there. And I think that, like if you want to kind of get people, as you said at the beginning, like when was last time I went to the cinema? If you want to get people hooked and back into cinema, like originality does play a role as well.
So my feeling about risk and incentive in general is that possibly people don't look at it the way that you need to look at it, which is on an individual basis. Because the way that the entertainment business works is that success has many fathers, but failure is an orphan. And so if you're an individual and you stick your neck out to get this original piece of content made and it fails, you very well are going to lose your job and possibly will be tarred for that for the rest of your career. Whereas if you produce something or greenlight something with a built-in audience, and even if it doesn't work, you can say a little bit, well, you can't blame me because this book sold this many copies and we got this person to direct. So it just didn't work. And I think that drives a lot of things in the same way that a lot of missteps that the entertainment business has made over the last 10 or 20 years have been driven by individual incentives. Hollywood created Netflix. The reason that Netflix was able to build, a dominance and a moat in streaming was because all of the content providers, the studios, they licensed their content to Netflix. Why did they do that? Because individuals were incentivized, because they got huge bonuses for bringing in all of this found money. People in the audience are always like, well, you should make more original films.
Yeah.
But people do make original films, and more often than not, they don't do that well. So it's a real challenge. I think that most of the new and original brands are going to come out of other media, particularly gaming, over the next 10 or 20 years. It is hard because Hollywood is risk averse, but it's taking a big risk in the long term because if the value of these catalog brands diminishes, then it's going to be left with nothing, or it's going to have to buy them more expensively. It's just an interesting area. People talk about it a lot, but ultimately it's more complex than one might assume just looking at it superficially. And look, I don't disagree with you. I will say one final thing. You know who is making original films and new things? The streamers. They're the ones who aren't as reliant on sequels. There are various reasons for that. Netflix has greenlit a lot of things recently over the last 5 years that I don't think a lot of theatrical studios would.
I guess also that feeds into the wider piece in regards to the content. Everybody wants people's attention in regards to the currency, but equally there's also a mechanism that needs to be fed in that allows for originality to layer in and also new storytellers and new lore to fall in to keep people hooked and engaged. And that's a challenge to both the movie streaming industry as well as the games industry as a whole. To kind of segue across into games, looking at the transmedia successes that have worked, people look at things like The Last of Us, which we're going to reference because The Last of Us is about to approach season 2. The trailers had some ridiculous numbers already. There's a lot of hype in regards to that. I'm a massive Last of Us fan, so I'm super stoked to see how that evolves and how they tell that second part story. From your perspective, what have been like the successful transmedia ventures in that regards? Those have made the leap from games to movies to streaming. And also kind of what other opportunities do you see in that landscape at this moment in time?
Obviously, there are a few ways you can look at success because one of the interesting things that we've seen pretty consistently is that player numbers and sales of the accompanying games have increased significantly when these shows and adaptations come out. I mean, look, the holy trinity, I suppose, recently is clearly The Last of Us, Fallout, and Super Mario, insofar as they were, with perhaps the exception of Super Mario, considered to be well-told, well-produced stories, but also were just incredibly commercially successful. And what's interesting about those is they all take slightly different approaches. So The Last of Us, at least in season 1, is a pretty close retelling of the story of the first game. Obviously, it famously adds some elements and makes some slight tweaks, but it's more or less the story of the game with most of the same beats. Fallout is set in a world and is, true quote unquote transmedia insofar as it mostly exists in continuity, in canon with the games. It's a sprawling world based on these underlying themes and principles. And so it's this notion of, well, this happened somewhere else at the same time as perhaps you're playing a game or before and after. And then, Super Mario obviously is a little bit different insofar as you've got kind of a very established character, but not really a very strong narrative outside of, I'm going to defeat Bowser and save the princess, or we're all going to have a nice race in our carts. And it's going to be very, very interesting, I think, to see how one of the biggest movies of 2027, The Legend of Zelda, which approach it takes, because Zelda has more story than Mario. Property and IP, incredibly beloved, where many of the games take on slightly different approaches, have slightly different aesthetics. They're almost living into the different worlds. So, and live action as well versus Mario. So that will be really, really interesting to see. But yeah, look, what I'd say about the video game adaptations is, and it's starting to click in this regard, is, it's not a jumping off point. It's not this thing's popular. Let's look at the cover art on the front of the box. Okay, let's do something around this and just make up our own thing. That doesn't work anymore, by and large. You must honor the feel and the fundamental core tenets of the IP. If you change those things, it will not work because the fans will reject it. And that's something I think that Last of Us did extraordinarily well. When I saw some of the first key art, and I think it was one of the cities, and it was, in the thunder, lightning storm, and you could see like the destroyed building and the rain. I was like, that's The Last of Us.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you had the same reaction.
No, like when I first saw it, I was like, oh my God. I'm one of the biggest Last of Us geeks that you'll ever come across. And when it comes to that franchise in particular, I had the same experience that I played the games many moons ago and then obviously started watching the series and naturally started diving back into the game. I really enjoyed it. And it's funny, that kind of experience that you get in regards to that connectivity to a brand. If you have the ability to really pull on the emotive heartstrings, those emotional core, those connective fibers, I think that's for me, a lot of it's laid down into character development, and a lot of it is also laid down into like, those classic human emotions of love, loss, redemption, fatherhood, parenthood. There's a lot of little, like, those underlying narratives that, to me, make for the best stories. And if you interweave them to like lived experience in a way that is kind of a little bit more real and authentic in and around the environments in which plays out, like it's what pulls people in. Like if you look at The Last of Us, when they did the evolution of the build narrative, episode 3, like that was done, to me, that was the best moment of TV for a long time. I just thought it was absolutely fantastic. And I'm equally intrigued as to how Joel and Ellie's relationship will be shown in the next season versus what it's like within the game. Yeah, like I think that there's a lot of emotional resonance there. Like, when it comes to great content, the depth of narrative for me is just as key as the actual engagement points. Like you have to have, well, I believe anyways, you have to have real deep understanding and deep connection to character in order to kind of really allow for those developments to play out. And it can't just be led on, you mentioned like Mario. Mario's a very basic game. And the reason that Mario played out as it is because there's not really that much depth behind Mario or Luigi. So like it's kind of has to be shot in such a way. But in other stories, like, I'll give you an example. I'm playing it for, again, like Red Dead Redemption 2 because I just love the story. Now, that to me would be a really intriguing IP to kind of make that transmedia jump. But yeah, I'd love to get your take.
Yeah, I mean, well, and Red Dead, I mean, not the easiest deal to make probably, but also you're bringing back the Western, so it'd be quite interesting to see. With The Last of Us, in a way, I mean, what I loved about that series was it showed all of the things that I already loved, and we have to remember that people who play these games, very often, if you're playing any video game nowadays, you're spending 10 hours to 120 hours within that world. So you've spent a lot of time with that IP. So it reflected that back aesthetically, the tone. But then, as you say, the added details that it brought to the world, I thought it did extraordinarily well, explaining or at least inferring the root of the outbreak. I thought was fantastic in that pilot episode. Now, of course, they've got a challenge because The Last of Us Part 2 happens to be one of my favorite sequels in any media. I absolutely love it, but it's divisive. It's structurally complex or different, I should say, in the game. It's a little bit nonlinear. It's going to be very, very interesting to see how they do. Now, I will say Caitlin Dever is, I think, one of the best actresses working today. So if you're going to have that kind of role, she's the best person you could ask for. The question really becomes, well, what else, what other games can you give a similar treatment? And I do think, Red Dead Redemption possibly, but then the question is, how do you're losing the open world aspects to it, which is also key to that experience. So do you do it as a 5-season TV series, but then the notion is, people who love the series can then go play the game and experience all the rest of the Western life. And that's what I do really love. I'm aware anecdotally, because people have told me, a lot of people who watched season 1 who weren't necessarily gamers, and then they went and they bought The Last of Us Part 1, and in a lot of instances, Part 2 as well, so they could, experience the game, or frankly, a lot of them, they want to know what happens next. And so they got into the second game, and obviously the accessibility settings are such that you can sort of customize that so that pretty much anyone of any experience can play it. I just think that game stories, game narratives, game worlds, totally undervalued. I think that games have some of the richest stories and characters, frankly. I think that we're going to see hit and miss adaptations. There are going to be some really, some ones that just don't work despite best intentions. You're going to see some bad faith ones where they completely lose the spirit of the game and do not respect and honor the IP. But I think you're also going to see some colossal successes, both commercial and creative. So I think it's an exciting time, and it's something that, obviously from a professional standpoint is keeping me fairly occupied as well.
I also look at from a games perspective, there's been a lot of layoffs, but if you look at from a storytelling perspective, I was kind of quite shocked, for example, with EA's approach to BioWare in regards to, what they did, some of the most gifted storytellers in the industry. And to me, it just looks like a perfect opportunity for them to reinvent themselves in a different form of entertainment. If you look at how they go about storytelling, it was, to me, there's a lot of lore to be told in that regard.
There's a question, and I'll say just to caveat, I'm not involved in BioShock. I agree. I think it's one of the best games of the last 20 years and such an immersive world. But how do you do it? Do you retell the story of the first game, or do you do something else within the world, whether that's drawing an element of Infinite or something else? I mean, that's the primary question.
I think it's like what you said about Red Dead. To me, if you want to tell that narrative, it comes down to pacing rather than like 1 or 2 seasons. It's told over a little bit longer of a duration. So people kind of slowly embedded into the character development, into the narrative that's unfolding. And you get an opportunity to tell more of a wider picture. And you can do that in a lot of ways. Like one of the, if you've watched things like Landman, but the pacing for that to me looks like the perfect kind of pacing that I'd look towards for a Red Dead, because you have opportunity to really delve into a character and an arc and an understanding of how these characters come together without kind of the over dramatization of something. It's a slower pacing.
But I think you've hit on something really important as well, which is that when you think video game adaptation, you think science fiction and fantasy and so on. But I do think that we're going to see things like the Sheridan procedurally type thing. I think stories come out of video games. I think it's going to be much more diverse in terms of breadth of storytelling than just first-person shooters and fantasy RPGs. And that's one of the things I think is quite interesting. Actually, one of the properties that's, it's nowhere yet in terms of things, but one of the things that I'm most excited about that I've been involved with is a game that's effectively a detective story. It's a classic detective story, and I think it could be absolutely amazing if you find the right partner for it. So.
Yeah, and look at what True Detectives did with McConaughey. Like that was just an incredible season back in the day. So yeah, you've got also good reference points as well, which I think when you're building out either a game or a movie, whatever, it comes down to the reference material as well. It's just as important so people can have an understanding as to the type of story you want to articulate. I think there's a lot of people looking at both industries in regards to layoffs and go, they're going through a period of flux. But yeah, to me, it looks like yet another paradigm shift in regards to an evolution of how we initially experienced content back in the day, as we referenced to Blockbuster earlier. That changed, the Netflix generation changed, and now how we are viewing entertainment as a whole. It's a multifaceted experience, and you have to create ecosystems these days where you have multiple connection points and touch points to engage with merchandise, story, the streaming, the game, the soundtrack, loads and loads of different connotations to it. And that to me is exciting.
It's an interesting time. And I think that the way younger people perhaps relate to some of these things is different from what preceded them in terms of habits. I think is, and I'm curious about your own experiences, is the notion of shared attention or co-viewing or the rest. Because the other thing that Hollywood has really had to wrestle with, I think, over the last particularly 5 to 10 years, is this notion that you're very seldom going to have somebody's undivided attention. They're going to be on scrolling the internet or on TikTok while they watch, or while they play a video game, they might be listening to a podcast. While they're playing Fortnite, they might be FaceTiming with their friends. And I think that's become sort of the native expectation of younger people to an extent, but that's transformative because that changes, for example, the role of a television director, because you can't rely solely on visual cues. You have to have that sort of verbal audio. You have to think about your pacing for something you may not be fully engaged.
But I think also, you hit on a great point there, but I also think that it's important to, I don't know, at the moment, we live in an environment whereby content is available 24/7 at our beck and call, and we can have every single episode of a season there and then, so we can binge. But to me, I would like to see a pivot back from the binging culture, because if you look at let's say we release an episode and then wait, and then an episode and then wait. You can build out the sub parts of that ecosystem to feed people's engagement as you're waiting for the next episode. So there's a reflection on the podcast. There's a new kind of DLC that was released on a game, some form of music that you can engage with. There may be a release of a sub comic book or whatever it may be. Lots of other things to feed people as they're on this evolutionary journey along the season's release. That to me is like, right, yeah, I would pivot against the existing norms.
I'll say, look, there are probably other examples, but right now I'm watching White Lotus and The Pit, and both of those shows only drop on a weekly basis, and it's looking forward for that next episode. I would say that the only challenge around it from the quote-unquote transmedia perspective and the other media is getting those production timelines and workflows to line up is really, really difficult. But yeah, the potential is there. If you look at some of the public statements that Netflix has made, including last week, they're looking into experiments around that. How can they tie, for example, their series to their games through the app? In theory, it's that way. They do the 2-part drop, maybe like season 3, part 1, and then they drop the game, and then they drop part 2 or whatever else.
What's your viewpoint on Netflix in that regard when, being XEA, looking at Mike Verdu's trajectory over there, now subsequent exit from Netflix, and they seemed for a proportion of time to be focused upon legacy content and building out kind of that portfolio, but now it looks like they're on a bit of a different trajectory. I'd love to get your view as to where you see Netflix in this kind of wider pie.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I don't know. I think that what they absolutely can do is to build their IP out in games. And I don't think that necessarily has to happen exclusively on the Netflix platform. I could see a great Stranger Things game that's available across platforms. But, the primary interest seems to be sort of mobile/casual type games. I think they did rather well with the Squid Game that came out quite recently. To me, the biggest challenge with the whole endeavor is this notion that you're going to use your phone as a controller, because that's fine with certain games. But I think for anything more complex, it just doesn't have the level of accuracy. But then, what are you going to do? You're going to ship everyone a controller, or you're going to make them connected via Bluetooth? They've got to work out what their goal is for gaming, and then what constitutes success. Is it, how many people have to play Netflix, games? How many people have to subscribe to Netflix to play the games? Because those are very different. Those are very different types of metrics, right? Versus, people who are like, well, it's there, I'll give it a try. I'll download a couple of games. I'll try Squid Game, versus this is so compelling that this is actually a value add for me. And I think they're miles away from the second one, to be honest. Yeah. But look, this is the thing. In the gaming market, there's been this sort of shift to this notion of, exclusives. Exclusives aren't financially viable, which may be true, given budgets, and they're less important. But to me, exclusives are everything. Having that game that you need to buy into that system, to buy into that ecosystem to play, that's really important. So I don't know. I think that's a very long-winded way for me to say, I don't know.
Before we move on to the next bit that I wanted to talk about, which is a changing of the deal paradigms, I want to touch upon Ubisoft. I want to gauge your perspective in regards to some of the news that's happened there. They've obviously just launched Shadows, but equally there's the evolution of the deal with Tencent. What's your initial take on that deal itself? And also, if you were a Ubisoft employee, how would you feel?
And look, I have no information here other than what was sort of publicly disclosed by Ubisoft. Clearly, Tencent has determined that those 3 IPs, Assassin's Creed, Far Cry, Rainbow Six, are sort of the most valuable ones. And it makes sense to sort of peel them off, isolate them, work on growing them out. But also, I think, at least 2 out of the 3, and probably all 3 of them, are not performing possibly to the extent that they could. So that needs to be worked on. What it means for Ubisoft employees and for its other brands, I don't know. Ubisoft does own a lot of brands, including things like Rayman and Prince of Persia, Beyond Good and Evil. And are those going to be licensed or perhaps sold to other companies? It's really, really hard to say. And I think if you're a Ubisoft employee, you would clearly have a lot of questions. I'm not really in a position to speculate around things. I will just say that, they obviously had some aspirations to do things in film and television and everything else. And I am curious as to how those plans may change or may even be accelerated. Because I am not a big fan at all of the existing Assassin's Creed movie, but I do think there's potential in that world in audiovisual linear. So we shall see.
And I guess, again, before we move on to the deal side of things, what would your viewpoint be in regards to the health of both industries, both like the movie and the gaming industry at this moment in time?
I think it depends on who you are. That's the bottom line. I think, and this is not really a novel thought, but in the games business, if you are a AAA developer with, dozens or hundreds of employees, a really long lead time, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years to get the game out, and you're making these big bets, I think it's really hard. I think it's particularly hard because games coming out of territories like South Korea and China and Eastern Europe can be made much less expensively. And they're also, I think there's a level of thought and specific player targeting that's much, much more sophisticated there, to be honest. You look at something like Kingdom Come Deliverance 2, it knows what it is, what it wants to be. It was made for, a very relatively manageable budget. There's a clear vision there, and it was profitable, I think, within a week. You look at, Black Myth Wukong, which obviously sold incredibly well in China, but also did business internationally. And all of this, you're competing with people's finite time and money. And against all the backdrop, you've got the black hole games and the multiplayer games that people won't put down, that, they're Fortnites and, Call of Duties. And so you're sort of filling a gap there. Plus, the really key thing is a lot of games from 10 years ago. Great. If I played BioShock, probably a year, 18 months ago, I went and played it for an hour or something, because it's been a long time on PS4, still plays phenomenally well. I could give you probably 30, 40, 50 titles that came out 10 years ago that I think are still fantastic in terms of gameplay and good enough in terms of visuals. And there's an incremental increase only. And so the point is, you've still got people playing The Witcher who've never played The Witcher 3.
Yeah.
So you come out with a new fancy RPG, you're competing at Skyrim and The Witcher 3. So I think I'm optimistic about the games business as a whole. I think, for certain types of games, there's a huge amount of opportunity. I think it's still the business where you can break through. I mean, look at this game at the moment that I had, some people texting me about earlier on. I heard about it at GDC. Have you heard about this one? It is called Schedule 1.
No.
It's tearing it up on the Steam charts. I think 400,000 concurrent. It was made by one person in Australia, made this game. One person in Australia, it seems, possibly had one or two people helping him, made this game. That person will have become an overnight millionaire. So, games remains one of the only things that you can do that in film and television. What I'll say is, again, it depends on where you are. Because if you are in Los Angeles, I can't be optimistic, because already production was declining. You had the strikes, which just pulled the air out of the room. It's very, very expensive to produce, relatively speaking. And you have crew all over the world, including like in countries like the Czech Republic and Hungary, who are really experienced. And at the same time, you have things like South Korean K-dramas. You have these Chinese, vertical video, short form serials. You have TikTok. You have all of these other things competing. A viewer is a viewer, whether your content costs $1 million an hour to make or 10 cents an hour to make. I think there's opportunity there. If I were counseling somebody who is 21, 22, coming out of university now, I'm not sure I could, in good faith, recommend they go into film and television if they're otherwise agnostic. I would say go into games, go into social media, go into the creator economy and look for opportunities there. But look, this is a world of flux, and flux creates opportunity for people who see the opportunity.
Talking about deals, like what would the typical structure be for people working from a game to film type of deal, as well as those working with other like regions of the world, such as Asia?
Yeah. So this is, and I alluded to this earlier on, because this is a really important shift, I think, in power dynamics. So the traditional type of entertainment deal, when you're acquiring any form of underlying right, a book, a podcast, an article, is the movie studio or the TV studio will want to take everything in that IP except the things reserved. So by default, you get an offer from a big studio for your book. It will say, we get the entire universe of this IP, but you can continue publishing the book. You can read the book aloud. You can read it on the radio, and you can write a sequel book, although we'll want some kind of right into the film television rights there. But if it's not mentioned as reserved, we, the studio, get it. Live stage, video games, merchandising, you name it. That is the default paradigm of Hollywood. And so when you get that offer, historically, you're trying to add things to the reserved rights. So we want to try and reserve merchandising. That is completely contrary to the philosophy of video game companies and also a lot of rights holders in Asia, such as, webtoons, anime, manga, etc. There, it's on its head. Well, no, this is our IP. We own this IP. We'll give you the right to make a movie, but everything else we reserve. And so they're coming from very different philosophies. And of course, this is where leverage comes in. Because if you're an author and you get, in a bidding war, a studio offers you $150,000 as an option fee. That's not to acquire the rights. That's to have the right to acquire the rights at some point in time. To an average person, on an average wage, a windfall of $150,000 might be very meaningful to them, to a lot of people, I imagine. However, if you are a manga creator who has sold 50 million copies, if you are a video game publisher who has sold 20, 30 million copies, and you're already making merchandise, and you're already doing live and experiential things to support your brand, and you're planning sequels, that's less important to you in terms of the cash. But also, you are not going to surrender control of your brand. Mm-hmm. And so that has led to a situation where effectively on the studio side of things, of course, has to be compromised. The studio side of things, they have to become, I think, more educated in what the expectations are, because they don't, the deal just simply won't make. And then you have to think of more creative approaches around things. So maybe it's splitting rights, maybe it's coordination, maybe it's how can we work together to build this thing up? Because remember, Fallout series comes out, sales of Fallout games go up. So there's a benefit for the games publisher in that respect. So it's much more complex. It's much more collaborative with those kinds of deals. And then you have some novel issues. So to give just one example, not to bore the viewers too much, but historically, any kind of new element that the studio created was owned by that studio. So if that studio, that movie studio, creates a new character, they own that character. AMC adapts The Walking Dead, creates the character of Daryl. That character is owned by AMC. And typically speaking, the original rights holder would not have a right to use that character. However, as you know, video games are a fluid medium. They're expanded. They have sequels. They have DLC. They have crossovers. They have all of these kinds of things. And in essence, I'm happy to say this has become quite accepted, that paradigm has shifted. And so now when the video game deal is being done, it's pretty normal for the video game company to have the right to take those new characters and new elements from the TV show and do a DLC around those characters. And obviously, my position would be that's beneficial for everyone. Now, there are a lot of devils in the details from a legal perspective. So, we could obviously go down that path, but that's what's shifting. And you know what? It's not just the actual game developer, it's the audience. Because the audience, well, I just watched this amazing episode and they introduced this entire new facility what we'd never seen before in the games. And I want to go and play in that facility. Oh, well, you can't, but I want to. And so you've got to follow the audience.
What about the variation between those kind of looking to acquire or work with, like the Asian market, for example?
Yeah, it's interesting. So from a legal perspective, and slightly into the weeds, but important for people to know if they're interested, there is a much stronger sense in Japan and Korea of something called moral rights than there is in the United States. It's more like a country like France in that respect. So when you have a manga creator, and they've often written and illustrated this thing for dozens or hundreds of issues, and they've built out this entire world. That manga creator is going to have approval rights around things. And so there are certain workarounds there, but ultimately, if you do not have that creator on board, you will not be able to proceed with whatever it may be, the video game, the movie, the television series. And I can say, while it's more nascent, I'm seeing similar things in Web2s. So, the people who create these things, they have a sense of, they're quite proprietary about their creative. But also, it goes back to what you said earlier, Peter, I think, community. Because it's not just that they are out of pure vanity, well, my creative vision is the best. No, they know their audience. That is what distinguishes, I think, a next generation or a future-proof creator. They know and they have a relationship and they understand their audience. And therefore, they're in a position to say, the audience will like this. The audience will not accept this. And that is so, so critical.
Yeah, I think to me anyways, when you look at the structure of a deal, and especially what you've articulated, the old way just doesn't seem effective in today's world, because what you really want is that cross-pollination of community whereby everybody wins in regards to that kind of collective, collaborative approach, rather than kind of a focus solely on ownership rights, because ownership rights can create blockades in regards to creativity, in regards to content. And as you say, if you see something that's of quality within a series that you want to then see transferred into the game, and there's arguments over ownership, then it dilutes the audience and it dilutes the engagement, and that's just ridiculous.
But I'll just add, on the sort of the moral rights, the creator rights piece, we saw recently the other side of the coin with James Bond, which is effectively there you had parties who had very strong approval rights and opinions, and effectively Amazon just paid them to go away in the end because it was viewed as an encumbrance. So it really depends on your point of view. A lot of these companies are fixated on building book value, on building, and owning as many assets as they can. And, again, it goes to individual incentives. If you're the person at the company doing that deal and you don't get a certain right, and then your boss or the CEO sees that right being exploited and comes to you, you might be fired. And so fear drives so much.
Yeah, definitely. I want to touch upon Roblox because we talked about it briefly at the beginning, but in regards to creative landscape and what it could be utilized for, and your overarching views and opinions.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. And this is an area that I am very much new to, and I'm learning partly through what we're doing, partly through conversations with people who are much more knowledgeable than myself. We met with some people at GDC who had been in the Roblox or the Minecraft space for over a decade. They were creators themselves and then sort of became business people within the space. So to pull out a few key points, the numbers are huge for the biggest games, hundreds of thousands. Some of the biggest games on Roblox would be the biggest games on Steam. So people don't necessarily understand that. Very social, very community oriented. So a lot of the creators of Roblox games might spend 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 hours a day in their Discord talking to their community, which becomes, it creates a sort of slightly, there could be risk there as far as it's somewhat parasocial, and it's this sort of unprecedented access to a community, which is very common for the creator economy, but wasn't previously. Infringement, it's rife. So you have varying levels of IP, from just straight knockoffs of games, from unauthorized use of trademark and copyrighted characters and designs, whether that's from video games, whether it's from television series, manga, anime. There's a huge amount, and there's sort of a cultural reticence sometimes to prosecute that, to shut it down, because you're going after the community. It's a little bit where a lot of other pieces of the internet were maybe 10 or 15 years ago. It's obviously going to be a hotbed for new IP. I mean, I've done, at this point in time, we did a year or two ago, I think it was probably the first Roblox to film television deal. That was actually with Russell. Interesting there for animation. But I see many more. I see many, many, many more. I don't think it's something that Hollywood's paying any attention to, but it's got that golden combination of things, which is, at its best, you've got rich worlds, with a lot of different things that you can do within them. You have a young audience who you might not be able to reach very easily through other means. You've got sort of the social and community aspect, and you've got people who are passionate about things. You make a Roblox series, you're not going to be able to do it without the creator's blessing. It's like any of these sort of prominent creators, you have to have them involved. And that's the piece. I'd say from a business standpoint, a lot of the Roblox creators are between the ages of 15 and 25 years old. And, the 25-year-olds would be the older age of the spectrum. And so effectively you found a scenario where they've created something. Now suddenly they're making, let's say, hundreds of thousands of dollars a month. and a business has to be built around them in real time, and they have to, be managed and counseled and so on. You have to do all the normal stuff, trademark registrations and getting the corporate structure set up and all these kinds of things. But they just want to make a great game.
Yeah.
They just want to engage with people and entertain people and then have fun. And now it's a business. But look, in the same way that people may be coming out of, in the 60s and 70s, right? If you were a young creative person, you tried to become a film director.
Yeah.
Now there's no question. You're going onto YouTube, TikTok, or increasingly Roblox, in my view.
Yeah, I'd love to get your take on AI. I don't want to go kind of deep down the Warren, because I know that a lot of people have fear about AI, but to me, the opportunity is the element I want to kind of focus in on.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because in theory, what AI does is provide a solution to some of the things that we've discussed already in this podcast. Escalating production costs, and therefore that's the line for the bar for profitability or break even. Because now if you can automate certain tasks, in theory, you can employ fewer people, you can bring the budgets down, you can do things more quickly. So that's the promise. I think it's incredibly complex, to be honest. I'm not going to get too much into the issue of, legally, you've got copyright issues, you've got name and likeness, you've got sort of deep fakes and misrepresentation. So there's a whole thorny world there. And we're going to see, I think, a lot of legislation and possibly litigation around those areas. From a sort of consumer standpoint, the question is whether people will accept it. And anecdotally from the last week, the answer might be yes, because in the last 7 days, I have seen probably 100+ images of different memes and different photos that have been Ghiblified, right? I'm sure you have as well.
It's crazy. But I look at it and I see the adding to IP rather than the extraction of IP's value. So I look at it and go, it's a bit like how communities work in general. If you go on Reddit or if you go on Discord or whatever, the way that people discuss and articulate IP and games and movies and such in general, like I think it's just an added layer. I understand the deeper levels and the finite details of the connotations of ownership and value and so on and so forth. But yeah, I've actually really enjoyed this past couple of days and seeing some of the things that come out. So yeah.
Well, people seem to be in one of two camps. And then look, I'm going to take away the people with a vested interest, like, for example, the venture capitalists who clearly have an interest in pushing this. But people seem to be in one of the two camps. I mean, your perspective in general there, I think, is quite remix culture-y, it's sort of pro-internet a little bit, because you are right. These things become almost like tokens, signs, symbols of communication, memes and so on, right? That it ceases to only be a film and television show, but it's something that people use to relate to each other and they build upon. But the problem with that is, from an IP standpoint, it's about control, it's about ownership, it's about these things, it's about the pre-existing frameworks, and it's also about where does the value flow? Because back in the NFT days, feel like about a decade ago, we had some quite progressive clients that wanted to do co-creation, user-generated content. And so we would build structures. But the question then becomes, well, okay, so let's say, we are admitting that this thing is based on the work of Studio Ghibli in some way, right? Let's just concede that it's trained on Ghibli films and it's recognizable and distinctive. Okay, now we're creating memes. What happens if I start selling a t-shirt with those memes? And maybe it's depicting a real person as well. What happens when we go to the next level, which, by the way, is happening very, very soon in my estimation, which is not only that we're sharing images, which I think are very quick and powerful and can be transmitted quickly, but now it's video clips. Now it's for movies. It's, I saw this thing, I'm sure you did as well. It's the trailer to Lord of the Rings that had been fed through this, basically what let's call the Ghibli machine. And people come in and say, well, this is trash, this is slop. But at the end of it, I looked at it and I was like, well, actually, I think that looks pretty good, considering it was probably done in about an hour, using this technology. So I just don't know. I have different hats that I'm wearing in this whole debate, but what I'm not seeing, frankly, is a huge amount of actual meaningful and concerted resistance from the entertainment business, because ultimately they want to make money, right? The studios won't push back on this kind of thing because they see a possibility for their costs to be lowered and their revenues to be increased. And that's what drives everything within this country. So unless there is something that happens from a legislative perspective, and I think we would look to Europe much more than we would look to the US in that perspective, I just don't, it's going to become an unstoppable onslaught. But that just creates a lot of issues and challenges all the time.
If you take CGI, for example, the cost of CGI, or even if you want, we mentioned the amount it costs to film in LA versus to go over to somewhere like Budapest, for example, the cost perspective in that regards, when you utilize tech, I think there is a lot of positives to it. But then again, if you look at the Ghibli example, it depends from a monetization piece. But for me, there is more in regards to brand engagement that you could utilize those types of pieces too. I saw a really good one about The Usual Suspects, which I thought was absolutely amazing. And again, it drew brand resonance to something that then subsequent from that, I went back and watched the film. Now, if you have that, and if you understand that's kind of how people work in regards to, we mentioned the attention earlier and attention retention. If you have stuff that feeds attention that can then feed retention down the line into other elements, then yeah, like I just think that there's a deeper narrative that can be discussed there. But I do appreciate the challenges because, yeah, it must be an absolute nightmare to kind of try and go through that to try and appreciate who owns the value of this versus the value of that. And yeah, it's challenging, but
attribute value. And I say that that's not even getting into the very complex technical copyright issues around training and so on. And, look, I think that there is another piece here, which is that there are certain people, I think, who have been sort of, look, everyone thinks they can make a movie, right? Yeah. Everyone thinks they can write a novel, but it's actually very, very hard to do those things. Yeah. And so what this is enabling is for people who, I'm going to be very slightly pejorative here, who aren't talented to be given the tools of talent, right? And so you can look at that from one perspective and say, well, those people are gatekeeping, right? They're gatekeeping, and now we're democratizing and people can create this stuff who couldn't previously. But then the other side of the coin is, well, yeah, but there's actually some value in that skill. I've worked my life to develop that skill, and I've, created a distinctive style, for example, and you've just stolen it and fed it through a machine. So I don't know. I think we all want to reprise this conversation a year from now and 2 years from now and 5 years from now and see where we're at.
Yeah, definitely. And then also we'll talk about discoverability at that point where we're just swept with like absolutely loads of content. I guess I could talk to you all day, to be honest, but I want to finish off with two things. What are the things in your perspective to watch out for the next 12 months? Actually, I'm going to put a third question in there. What content is really driving your interest and engagement at this point in time? And finally, what would your key thought and takeaway be for our audience?
So in terms of content, I mean, I've alluded to, a few things on this already. I do think in television that I think the pitch is extraordinary insofar as how it marries traditional sort of hospital procedural drama things with just feeling very visceral and with the format and the acting and everything. I think it's absolutely stellar. It won't surprise you that, a lot of what interests me is in games. So I came off of Kingdom Come Deliverance. I'll be quite surprised if anything beats that for my game of the year. I think there's just an incredible level of storytelling and world building within that game, not to mention player choice and Kazan, which is, I'm a big Souls-like player. So Kazan and the New Lies of P. I mean, look, from an entertainment perspective, it's hard to look past GTA. And I think what's going to be really interesting to do is to see what if GTA is the black hole, what sort of pull it, because everyone's going to avoid it. And that will be in games, but also I'm not sure I would want to open a movie against it. As far as movies go, you've got the DC relaunch, fascinating to watch. You have also what I'm going to predict with some level of confidence will be a soft reboot via Fantastic Four and then the next Avengers movies. I think Marvel has had some missteps, and so it'll be very interesting to see if audiences will re-engage with Marvel. We talked about Netflix games. I'm curious as to whether Netflix can actually build another franchise on top of Stranger Things, which is ending, and a Squid Game and some of their others. I wonder if people are going to start making some bigger bets again, especially in television, because those kinds of big series have not been, after Rings of Power and those kinds of things, those have not been preferred. But there are some fantasy novels that I really love and would love to see adapted. There are a bunch of games that I would love to see adapted, but would be expensive, Mass Effect. So that's it. AI, we've got to watch for sure. It said shared viewing and look, obviously community and to a certain extent, the culture wars as well, because, it's not something I really want to get into, but it is clear that it's all completely due to the internet. Society's getting more divided. There's more of a divide between male and female audiences and sensibilities. So that's a piece as well. So we'll see. But yeah, I guess final thing would be like, what's going to be the next Barbie? The next thing that just comes out that just kind of blows people away that wasn't really expected. Because that's always interesting. I didn't call that was going to be a complete cultural phenomenon in the way that it was. And I think that's fantastic. Oh, and I should shout out to the new Final Destination movie. I can't leave that out. Comes out in May. The greatest film franchise of all time. You've got to go and see the new Final Destination in theaters.
Oh, man. I remember when that first came out, I was like, oh, this is amazing. But yeah, it's been an absolute pleasure speaking. I'm sure it'll be the first of many conversations. And thank you so much for your time. Thank you.
No, but thank you for having me. And I'll look forward to hearing this. And you can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to engage about all of this stuff. And roll on The Last of Us. Maybe this will get like converted into like an after show. After each episode, we just talk about The Last of Us.
No, take it easy.
That's it.